right, up next trainee data blitz we have is Sydney Myers. So Sydney is pursuing an MD PhD at Northwestern Feinberg School of Medicine and co-lead of the Safe Living Space research team. Through her work with Safe Living Space, Sydney has worked closely with clinicians to develop novel theories on traumatic brainstem injury, including physiologic biomarkers and gender differences in symptoms and prognosis of whiplash mechanisms of TBI. Sydney's research has contributed to a SLS SCOTUS amicus brief on strangulation-induced brain injury and been included in policy recommendations and presentations. Sydney is passionate about expanding medical knowledge on traumatic brain injury to shape policy and access to care for high-risk populations, often with unrecognized brain injury and cumulative brain injury. And she'll be presenting on prevalence of brain injury among heads of household coming into 7 domestic violence for intimate partner violence shelters in New York City. All right, go ahead, Sydney.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen. So first off, I'd love to thank our founder and CEO, Dr. Edie Zussman, for her work contributing to this, and also 2 of our research team members, Sweta Mann and Rachel Klaus. So as we know, brain injury can be invisible, and it surprised me when I first started working with this population that a lot of the symptoms that are endorsed by survivors are recognized by the CDC as signs of a TBI, but there's a little bit of a disconnect between first responders and the people who are seeing these survivors and recognizing that they have a TBI. And unfortunately, that leads to this cycle of a starting point of physical abuse and then evaluation of survivors from first responders, the emergency department, the justice system, and then eventually a shelter. But unfortunately, the fact that the brain injury is not being recognized actually perpetuates the cycle back into the starting point. And so our question is, can brain injury awareness disrupt this cycle and keep people safe from multiple brain injuries? And so first, before I get into the results and the methods of the study that I'm talking about today, I think it's important to go into some of the background of the mechanisms of an abuse-induced brain injury. So first is a direct impact to the head. And this is classically what we think about as a concussion. Anything that is hitting the head or the head being hit against anything can cause the brain to kind of smush up against the skull at that point and cause local damage there. And second, we have whiplash, which is a sudden acceleration or deceleration, plus or minus an angular component of a side to side. And this causes an axonal stretch injury at the occipitocervical junction. And this can be from shaking, being pushed, or a fist to the jaw. And it's important to note that whiplash injuries take 48 to 72 hours for symptoms to manifest. And this is because the acute stress hormones may be initially protective, and the swelling and inflammation after the injury may take time to develop. And so a lot of times when these patients present, they might have different reports of their stories depending on when they're evaluated, and they might have some forgetfulness or endorse different symptoms at different times. And it's just important to recognize that this is actually part of the nature and pathophysiology of this injury. And next, third, we have a hypoxic ischemic brain injury, which occurs when anything is pressing against the neck that blocks jugular outflow from the brain at lower pressures, and at higher pressures, it actually blocks the arterial inflow of blood to the brain. And so this pathophysiology is if you block venous obstruction, you actually cause increased intracranial pressure. And if you block arterial obstruction, you cause a lack of oxygen input to the brain. And so examples of this can be strangulation or choking. And it's really important to recognize this clinical syndrome because patients who have a hypoxic ischemic brain injury have an increased risk of 4 to 8% of stroke within 6 months of this initial injury. And so the reason that I went through all of those mechanisms is that 2 out of 3 of them don't involve a direct hit to the head. And so to our team at Safe Living Space, this means that more education on the mechanisms of brain injury is needed to detect all 3 types of brain injuries caused by domestic violence and intimate partner violence, because the second 2 especially may not be immediately associated with a brain trauma, though they very much do cause brain pathophysiology. And so we wanted to see if a really sensitive screening could be done, and implement this in a real world setting. And so we partnered with Volunteers of America, Greater New York, to see what we could do. And so here are our methods. So we wanted to implement an abuse-induced brain injury screening. So we designed a client intake process as part of an expanded brain trauma aware assessment. We implemented this at 7 shelters in New York City with the primary aim of determining the prevalence of head and neck injuries. And our time period, we started in June 2023, and we have updated data as of last month. And so I wanted to start out just with a key finding. So we had 833 total respondents, and 52 of those respondents had experienced at least one injury to the head or neck within the last year. What's more, 34% of respondents had had 3 or more head and neck injuries. And we think of brain injuries as cumulative. And if you have one brain injury, that increases your risk of having another one. And so that 34% is a really important number to track as well. So a little bit of demographic information. Of the 33 clients, 802 identified as female, and the majority of them were in the 20 to 40-year-old range. So what exactly were their injury mechanisms? We wanted to ask broadly about different experiences that could be categorized into our 3 types of brain injury mechanisms, but not ask about the injury mechanisms directly. So this experience language was really important. So we asked if they had experienced any kicking, punching, or being struck with fists, struck with objects, being choked, and they could select multiple, and oftentimes there were multiple experiences within the last year. And then we can then categorize each of these experiences into the type of brain injury that might have been experienced. But something that I do want to point out here is that both the choking and strangled with hands or objects could be categorized as that hypoxic ischemic brain injury, but survivors were more likely to endorse being choked versus being strangled. And so this tells us a little bit about the language that they're more comfortable using and endorsing. So we also wanted to note the time, the recency from the brain injury to their presentation at the shelter. And so this just shows that there are some cases that are very, very acute, but a lot of the presenting clients actually have a more subacute clinical picture that, for an injury that happened more than 6 weeks prior. And so the symptoms that they were endorsing, the most common was headache. But there were still significant clients endorsing forgetfulness and difficulty with emotional regulation, amnesia, difficulty speaking or swallowing, feeling dizzy, ringing in the ear. And so we did ask this question in the context of being associated with a recent head or neck trauma, but we noticed that significant portion of client intake assessments, they actually decided to skip this question. And so in the future, we want to try to de-identify their symptoms as being associated with a recent head or neck trauma and just ask about symptoms generally that they may or may not be experiencing. And so that's just something for future work that we were thinking. So next, we wanted to characterize the presentation to come up with some sort of clinical rule to try to identify clients who might need immediate medical intervention, clients who might have an active acute brain injury that needs attention. And so we wanted to break out the percentage of clients with at least one injury and one symptom that was observed, and then percentage with at least one injury and one symptom that was reported by an intake personnel, and percentage with at least one injury and one symptom either reported or observed. And so this is more a future direction of trying to develop a clinical rule, but we did ask about their symptoms, and separately we had the client intake personnel evaluating them for clinical signs, objective signs of brain injury. So we just wanted to see how much overlap there was between observed and endorsed symptoms. And so we do have a few limitations of this study, and the number one being a hit to the head or neck does not always indicate a concussion. And so we can't diagnose survivors with a brain injury, and also the clientele that we were working with and the staff that we were working with was not comfortable diagnosing a brain injury, but we wanted to more outline that we wanted to see the prevalence of specific symptoms, the prevalence of specific experiences, and that does unfortunately require us to extrapolate out the actual number of brain injuries requiring treatment. But I think this was just a good starting point and starting to get staff more comfortable asking these questions about specific experiences that might increase risk of brain injury. And so I also wanted to highlight that recently the New York City Council passed funding to train first responders in New York City to assess for brain injury on all DV-IPV calls. And so this is a picture of the Volunteers of America Greater New York hosting a rally in response to that announcement. So that was really exciting for us. And so implications and future directions, truly, this project just highlighted that more sensitive screening methods for abuse-induced brain injury that get into the specific experiences, specific mechanisms of injury, plus increased awareness of abuse-induced brain injury from first responders, advocates, and healthcare providers can then lead to breaking the cycle of invisible traumatic brain injury and developing a pipeline for survivors to receive appropriate care and support. And so this was all part of work being done by Safe Living Space. These are some pictures of our members from our annual 5K to raise awareness about brain injury in DV-IPV populations. And we welcome collaboration. So if any of you would like to work with us, we're very open to that. And there's some contact information on this slide. So thank you so much for having me. And that's all I have for today.
Thank you so much. Really incredible presentation. I really enjoy the, breaking down the barriers to have that talk. You really interact with those workers who are on the ground in the domestic violence shelters. So what would you say was sort of the main thing that you learned working with those domestic violence organization workers and vice versa?
That's a really amazing question. Unfortunately, I didn't have the experience to work directly on the ground. I think that's a really unique thing about Safe Living Space is that we are a nationwide organization. And so if you do want to be that person working directly with the shelters in your area, you absolutely can be. But my role in this project was much more of a data analysis role.
Yeah. And what do you think are the next steps for this project? Seems like you got a great response from New York with some policy changes as well. How do you see this project growing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our Safe Living Space team's currently expanding on this work by writing a vocational rehabilitation grant with Volunteers of America to use cognitive brain injury assessments as a guidance to to design job training and placement for people who are insecurely housed. So we do really want to expand on this work and also use those clinical prediction rules that I was kind of touching on to really funnel the high risk clients to get immediate medical attention.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you have a lot of love and positive things in the chat if you want to take a look. But coming up next, we have a short 5-minute break. And then we have our next speaker. All right, thank you so much.
Thanks.